Well, hey, Roger, you got a different face out there too. I love your avatar.
Hey, Scott. Thanks. Appreciate it.
That
I
was the
thought it was pretty
avatar we were
cool.
trying to get last time. I couldn't figure out how to do it. I had to look it up.
Yeah, well, it's like with a lot of technology, it takes a little practice here and there, and you finally get it right. So we're good.
Right.
So
Exactly right. So, hey, so we'll jump in here and we'll kind of, get going here, but we're just trying to give you some interesting legal perspective. And he was blowing my mind just a little before, and I'm going to let him do his own little thing of blowing your mind with that too. But again, the issue that we're bringing up here is the essence of NESARA and the legal area of this. So, this is just one of those pieces of pie, but they all interact. It's kind of like when you make a pie, which apple piece is going in which piece of the pie. Well, they're all over the place, right?
hopefully
So
all the good ones.
yeah, hopefully it all tastes good in there too.
Yes.
But I think the NESARA thing is way integrated in here, and then we'll kind of give you an understanding of that part with that too. So this is our second part of this, and we're going to just kind of move through these questions. Let Roger answer, who's been a lawyer for a very long time, has been around all this stuff for quite a while, and he has a real interesting perspective. And then we'll kind of do the surprise one at the end. Guys, stick around for that one too. Okay. All right. So firstly, let's talk about this one. Can you differentiate the regulations when we move all the way from a regulation to constitutional law along the legal boundaries? Hope I said that right enough for you.
Yes. Okay. So I think what's important to understand is that the Constitution itself is a document that we put in place to be the supreme law of the land. And regulations were an administrative state concoction, if you will, or creation that actually took place as a result of administrative agencies created in the 1930s and 40s running wild and creating too much uncertainty, too many differing viewpoints and outcomes. People could not rely on what the decisions were because they may change every time an issue would come before a particular agency. So in 1946, they adopted the Administrative Procedures Act, which was essentially an act that said, okay, administrative agencies, if you're going to make or promulgate regulations, there's a process you have to follow. And that way, then people who are impacted by these regulations will know what the process is. And for example, they'll know the difference between the formal rulemaking process or an adjudication where someone challenges an agency or the agency goes after an individual, and they take that all the way to a process whereby there is a decision, maybe by an administrative law judge, that may or may not be appealed to a federal court, or there may be an issue that might go to a federal court and make it up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court would then uphold that particular formal adjudication process.
In essence, though, what you're saying too is like, Scott writes a law, a regulation, under like Department of Rehab Services, where I interact with a lot. So I write a regulation about how we want to do something, and I'm the part of the regulatory agency. But Roger comes in and goes, wait a second, that doesn't work, and here's why. And I go, nope, this is how we're doing it. And if we if we couldn't come to an agreement and neither one is going to bend on that, then it can go up to court cases. So in essence, it's like contract law, or how would you look at that in that way?
Well, actually, I would take a different approach to it. What happened is, so when they put the Administrative Procedures Act in place, what Congress was doing, Congress and the Senate, they were writing legislation trying to create laws that would implement a lot of these different agencies that were being created. To give you an example, and we can always cover this later, but today in our country, we have 650 departments, agencies, bureaus within the federal government. And that gobbles up $2.4 trillion a year in resources. And if you sit here and take a look at it with all those different entities out there, they need to stay busy. So you now have a Congress who creates them, who gives them latitude and authority on how to move forward and implement whatever processes might be there. And then you have the Congress who is saying, we need to go tweak these here and there, but we're not going to tell them what to do. We're going to give them wide latitude so they can decide how they wish to respond to issues that come up. And the difficulty you have is if you look at any legislation, one thing you see is they are very definite on how they want the law to be, but they're very vague as to how you implement that law. And that's done intentionally so that these administrative agencies have wide latitude to do what they want to. So it's basically, at one point, the administrative agencies were supposed to be part of the executive branch. They've actually become the fourth branch of our government.
Right.
Executive, legislative, the courts, and the administrative agencies. So they have got a huge amount of power. And so what you see is many times you will see these agencies say, well, if we don't like the way something is, we're going to Capitol Hill and we're going to get the law tweaked a bit. So that gives us more authority. And this process continued up until the early 80s, when there were court cases that were beginning to fill the court docket over challenging the different agencies, EPA, rehabilitative services, just a whole variety of different type of agencies. And what the court said at that point in time was that, look, Congress gave wide deference to the agencies. We need to honor that too. We need to let that process go forward. So that process continued forward up until this year, where the Roberts Court said,
which was the
we're not doing it
Chevron
anymore.
defense,
That was the
right?
Chevron deference, yes.
Right.
And so what they did is they said, no, we're not going to do that anymore. We're going to throw that out. Now, again, one of the perspectives that I have along this is that if we look at that on one track, and then we have a separate track that says we have the generals and the white hats coming together to try and overthrow the deep state, we've had these two running in parallel for probably the better part of 70 to maybe as many as 250 years. And so we are looking at how we are trying to address these issues. And so I believe that the Chevron decision that overturned the Chevron deference is essentially one of many, many additional court cases that the court's going to be releasing.
Wow.
Because if we sit here and take a look at it, our Constitution has been, I use the term hamstrung, it's been tied up in knots, if you will, by the administrative state. And in order to get back to a truly constitutional law basis in our republic, we need to have the Supreme Court come back and say, look, all these decisions we made, whether it be search and seizure protections, other types of protections that they twisted and turned in the Bill of Rights, or the Voting Rights Act, or equal rights, or whatever it might be, they need to throw all that stuff out. So that's going to take several court cases to rip all that stuff apart and get us back to the point of where we have a true constitution that we can rely on for constitutional law. Because the one thing that attorneys are good at doing, and I say the reason they're good at doing it because they're the ones that make the arguments before the courts as to whether decisions should be one way or the other. They are very good. They're very well educated at how do they craft their argument to take something simple as the placement of a comma or a period to interpret the law. And so what we have to do is we have to go back to a more simplistic approach. And by that, I mean just stripping away all this other stuff from the Constitution that has grown over the years through precedent, stare decisis, and everything else. And I personally believe if we're looking at this as being a white hat operation, that the white hats, and in addition to the Brunson case, there are other cases that the court can easily release. They would say, no, we're moving away from this. Just like we did with Chevron, we're moving away from these other matters. Now, people might say, well, they can't do that. I said, actually they can, because we give our courts, the legislative branch and the executive branch, the opportunities to serve as our governing bodies. But it's up to the court to say, this is not considered to be a constitutional representation of what the law should be. In other words, the law is unconstitutional. And if they go back, and because of the way our court cases have been determined over the years, we can actually have a court go back and say, no, we're not going to do that anymore. The justices were misled. The justices did not totally understand. They failed to consider this in prior cases. And so it's very easy to overturn a case that some people might say, well, you can't because it's stare decisis and that ruling stands. You easily can. And so that's the perspective I'm coming from when we start looking at these. And so, for example, when you go from the regulatory sphere that we're in today to a truly constitutional sphere, we're moving away from all that other type of information out there that has allowed the administrative state, and I'll refer to it as the administrative state, which is closely in lockstep with the deep state to tie up Americans and to tie up Americans' property and to tie up our liberty and our freedoms.
Yeah. So, I mean, if anyone's ever read contract law and you read through, these paragraphs, I mean, as a person who has a degree in English, I mean, I sit there and looking at these sentences, and sometimes near run-on level, sentences that go on with all these, with all these provisos in there and semicolons and commas and all this other stuff. And I'm like, wait a second, where are you going with this? And because just even the normal person, or someone who's even got a degree in English, looks at it and says, I don't get it. I mean, where are you trying to go? And yet what you're saying is the lawyers have a reason for what they're doing. And when they say that.
Yes. And one of the reasons is if you can tie these things together and make your sentences long, number one, it becomes misleading. Number two, it opens the door for interpretation of what you meant.
Right.
And that's one of the reasons why with a lot of the regulations you'll see when they are written, you've got attorneys writing them. And you've got people saying, okay, so if we make this complex enough, it's going to be difficult for the court to say this is what you clearly meant, as opposed to this might be what you clearly meant.
Right.
Then what the court's going to do is say, we're going to give deference to the agency and let the agency determine it. And 9 times out of 10, the agency is going to, at that point in time, make a decision, whose side are we going to be on? Are we going to be on the individual, or are we going to be on the side of the administrative state? And the administrative state usually wins out.
Right. So when we move into a constitutional republic, which I believe we're going there, and we'll get to that one at the end here, but when we move into a constitutional republic, things get more simple so that everyone can kind of say, yeah, that makes sense.
Yes, they do. And again, from my perspective, I mean, I'm an attorney. I spend a lot of time doing a lot of different things, but when it comes to writing and interpreting statutes and administrative rules and regulations. But I have to tell you, the one thing that I find to be the most frustrating is that it doesn't have to be that way. You can make it simple. You can keep your words short. You can abbreviate things. You can identify brevity in language and accomplish a point that people easily understand. And that's what I've always tried to do in the work that I've done.
Yeah.
Both for clients that I represent and when doing either statutory or administrative procedures work.
Yeah, that's what really kind of attracted me, how you think. And so that's a beautiful point. Okay, so let's pop on into our next kind of area. Is a bar a good or a bad thing? So maybe we need to explain what the bar is and a little of the history of that.
Sure. There's I'll start by looking at the history of it. Originally, the bar, a lot of people refer to as the British Admiralty Registry, which was what Britain actually, or England actually set up in the 1600s, because they wanted a sense of who was actually going into the courtroom and arguing their cases in front of the judges in there. So they wanted to keep track of the barristers that were doing that. So they started that process. When in the early days of the United States, when the 13 colonies were here, they adopted that same type of registry because they wanted to know who was going in and who was doing what. And then once our Constitution was approved and enacted and actually became ratified by the colonies, the Supreme Court actually in 1790 made the decision that they were going to start preparing rules and procedures for the court. And what's interesting, if you read through that, their decision at that point in time did not refer to the bar as the British Admiralty Registry. They referred to it as the design in their courtroom. So if you look at most courtrooms, you actually have a rail that separates the public spectator location and the attorneys and the plaintiffs and the plaintiffs, witnesses, and defendants that go on the other side of the bar. And so what they did is they say, we're going to call this the bar. And so it's actually, capital B, lowercase AR. And so what they did is they created a process whereby if you were going to be a member of the bar, that is people who were permitted by the court to go beyond the rail, then you had to be approved by the court to be able to practice and appear in front of them. And the interesting thing is that as time's gone on, you had state bar associations that worked with state boards to decide who could become an attorney and who could not be. But if you became an attorney, most of the bar associations say, well, it's voluntary membership. The problem is that it's a requirement in most states.
Sure it is.
Because when you're a member of the bar, they control your license. And if you don't have a bar card that you can show to people, then, you may or may not be licensed. And if they find out that you're parading as an attorney, even though you're not licensed, then they get you for unauthorized practice of law. So they have been regulating the industry like that for a long period of time.
But they've been doing that to a lot of other industries. I mean, as an
Yes.
audiologist, if I'm not, like, it's called ASHA certified with that too, then I can be non-ASHA certified, but I can't have a young kid coming in and being underneath them so that they can be ASHA certified. And they create these extra regulations, and they're, some of it's trying to be, let's do this correctly, but some of it gets, really administrative.
It does. And I think one of the important things to remember about the bar and the confusion that comes with this, when the colonies were formed, the biggest cases that they faced were admiralty or maritime law. Because, for example, if you're in the U.S. and you order a shipment of goods from overseas, and by the time they get here, they may be damaged, they may be lost, they may have something may have happened to them. The boat may have sunk, and so you want to be able to get recourse against the company that you bought those from and
Right.
shipped them here. So you have admiralty and maritime law, and we still have that today. But what the court did is, rather than the court saying we're going to be governed by admiralty and maritime law, that's going to be one segment of what we have. As the colonies began to form, there was a realization that, you have land here, you have common law that was carried over from England,
Right.
and you have other types of rules that would be put in place by governments. Because,
Right.
from a spiritual perspective, if we believe in God, which I do, God gave us governments to help keep us in order and organized, but he put governments in the hands of men to be able to control the governments that help the people achieve what they need to achieve. And so what happened over time is that a lot of these courts became self-serving. And so again, you would have the Supreme Court come down ever so often, and they would issue formal rules of civil procedure. And that would deal with anything that's a civil matter. And then they would have federal rules of criminal procedure, and that would deal with anyone who's been accused of a crime. And they might have federal rules of bankruptcy, which, again, are a separate, different rule, collection of rules. And so, for example, you will see attorneys, if you walk into an attorney's office and they do civil and criminal practice, or even bankruptcy, you might see a book on the shelf that says federal rules of civil procedure, criminal procedure, or bankruptcy procedure. So those are all the things the court puts in place. But what they've done in each of those is they have preserved, where appropriate, admiralty law, maritime law, common law, man-made law.
Right.
And so the procedures, the rules and procedures address each of those. And so that's been a little bit of carryover from the British Admiralty Registry and what happened in England before the United States was created. The colonies were created and the U.S. became a country.
Okay.
And now what's interesting is you also have states that carry that to the next level, and the state courts will actually have their own rules of procedure as well.
So how do you feel about, the concept, and not saying we should or shouldn't, but it's a pretty common viewpoint at this point. A lot of patriots go, we just need to delete the bar. And how would you respond to that?
Well, I would say, okay, so there's a couple of things from my perspective. In the past, several decades, I've had some back and forth with State Bar Association on a variety of different things. My biggest issue was that bar associations tend to be political in nature, and they raise dues from the attorneys. It's a mandatory contribution. And then they take their resources and they will work the legislature and administrative process. And many times they're coming down on what I would consider to be the wrong side. In other words, they're coming down on the side of big government.
Right.
They're down on the side of individuals being forced to relieve themselves of their property and their money and their freedoms. And so in that regard, I think the bar is something that needs to go by the wayside. On the other hand, when I sit here and take a look at some of the other things that the bar brings, some of the bar associations will have opportunities for attorneys to develop relationships with each other. And when I talk about, I mean like client referrals. One of the things that I get asked all the time when I become a bar member, do you want to do client referrals? Or do you want to represent pro bono cases? Or do you want to do a variety of other things? For a lot of attorneys, if you happen to go in a courtroom and watch a series of cases and you happen to sit in the public section in the back, one of the reasons you don't see a lot of attorneys doing that is because if there's somebody there who can't afford a lawyer, they become that person's lawyer. But the judge has the authority to appoint them as an indigent representation for that. Right. So there's a lot of positive things that can come from that. And, the belief is that everyone, if they want to use the courts, should have access to an attorney. So I think in some of those areas, it's good. The problem, though, is that as we make these things more complicated, the old saying that my grandparents used was that you need a Philadelphia lawyer to figure it out because the average person can't do it. It's so complex. Right. And I think if we're truly going to move to a constitutional law basis where we give people the opportunity to contract with each other, to engage in permissive activities under our Constitution, we really kind of need to pull back what the responsibilities of the bar and attorneys in particular are going to be.
Which goes back to your original point: simplify.
Yes.
But I'm not, I guess I'm not personally opposed to. Maybe we don't call it the bar; we call it, a lawyers association. I mean, for interaction, you might come up with something. I don't do that kind of law. Let me check with my group to see who might be doing that in that city or whatever, and I'm fine with those kinds of things, or even some way of saying, hey, listen, you are messing up. We're not going to continue to certify you, or whatever that might be.
Yes. Well, and I think the other part, I'm not stating that bar associations are unnecessary. I'm just saying that I believe that if we look at going back to a constitutional common law based society, that the most important thing is that rather than having a select minority control access to the courtrooms, we kind of open the doors up and we help educate the public about what your rights are. I will tell you, I have spent multiple hours over my life as an attorney talking to people. They'll come to me and they say they have an issue, and so I'll talk to them a bit about it. And they say, I need to hire a lawyer. And I go, well, actually, you don't. Here's how you can do this without a lawyer. Because I want them to be able to have the knowledge and understanding about how they go forward to deal with this, what they have to look for, what their choices and options are. I've had people talk to me about small claims court. I will walk them through the process for small claims court and provide them the guidance that they need, because I believe that's very important. There are a lot of things that I believe individuals can do for themselves without having to go to an attorney and spend a week, a month, a year's salary to try and find out something that they need to do to protect their property interests and their freedom.
Right. And especially when someone's at that point of protecting their freedom or property, they probably don't have the money, or very many times they don't have the resources to be able to do that, and because it takes so long
yes
to accomplish it.
And for a lot of these, the information that they need is there in the public. The other downside of that is that sometimes you will get people who say, well, I've read this and it's the law. And so having a conversation with them about how, well, it might be the law, but it's not the law. I had one recently where someone come forward and said, well, the law says I can do this. And I said, no, you're missing the point, because you're taking a phrase out of a sentence that if you read the entire sentence, it starts out, for those who have a disability and comply under the Americans with Disability Act, right, you have the opportunity to do this. I said, so you have to take that sentence as a whole. It doesn't mean you can go in and do what you want to do because you saw it there. So the other thing is, you take, for example, we talked about this last time, the difference between a condominium association and a homeowners association. So right, there's distinctions within the law that I believe it's helpful for folks to understand. And once right, you get to that point, then I think you can really stand up and protect your own interests. And that's what I'm about, is the education. I don't believe you should have to go into debt to become an attorney, pass a bar exam to be able to say I can give advice. I think it's, especially when it's for individuals or family members, I think it's important to be knowledgeable about what the resources are and where you can go. It's just like with family law. Most family law issues can be dealt with by either talking to a pastor, talking to a counselor who understands, going through some kind of a mediation process,
Right.
and working to try and rebuild your life and get away from whatever the vice was or the problem was that drove a wedge between the spouses.
Right.
So there's a lot of different ways that you can do this. And even attorneys do something they refer to as facilitated mediation, where they will sit here and work with people to help them solve a problem and move forward. And I believe that as we go back towards the common law and constitutional law, that we're going to see more of those types of activities going forward, and less of a need for big law firms, for attorneys that charge outrageous rates and take advantage of people.
Absolutely. Okay. Okay, so let's just jump into the next point. So what does it mean inside of NESARA circles? So these are, lots of people will talk about this, is to retrain the judges and the attorney in constitutional law. We sort of talked about this. Let's be more specific about that if you'd like to.
Sure. What happens in law schools is that they give you a list of different courses that you take. And one of those courses is constitutional law.
Right.
And so it's usually a year-long course, and you go through that course and you learn how the Constitution has been developed over time, through court cases, through interpretation, through statutory changes, through challenges, through a variety of different means. And so you reach a point where you understand the complexities of the Constitution, and any good attorney that specializes in constitutional law will tell you that it's truly a unique specialty, where you have to understand the ins and outs. And I'll give you one example of that. If you take, years ago, we had several efforts to try and create a balanced budget amendment. And so you go through the process, and most of the people that I worked with on that were constitutional experts would talk about how the Constitution originally framed the responsibilities of the Congress,
right,
and how debt was dealt with, and how the changes took place to create more debt and implement the tax structure and to go forward. So they deal with that particular specialty. And so if they were to actually go forward with a balanced budget amendment, not that we would get from a constitutional convention, which is one of the ways that we get these amendments, but through the process of actually crafting it, getting the states to get on board to petition the Congress to draft the amendment, to send back to the states for ratification, that's a very complex process. And you have to do it in such a way that you keep it narrowly defined for what you're trying to do. And so many of the questions that would come up, well, is it constitutionally permissible for the federal government to limit states where money gets spent? And the answer would always be, if the federal government is giving you the money, they can tell you how to spend it.
Right.
So he would go through and lay out the rationale for that. And it was a very educational process to go through and do that. But again, that's very complex. And so if we look at most attorneys today, they will come in, they will use statutes to start their argument. They will say that, for example, in free speech, they will cite the First Amendment, freedom of speech, and then they will talk about cases that have limited or expanded free speech. They will talk about the fact that you have limitations on what kind of free speech you have. You can't yell fire in a crowded movie theater because it's going to result in injuries to other people. And they will go through and dissect that, and they will spend time trying to address the issue about how do we get to protecting your free speech. That's a very convoluted way around of saying, look, you have freedom of speech.
Right.
And if you use common sense, your freedom of speech should never be interrupted. Now, common sense also includes posting to social media. And it includes talking in public to people and saying what you want. But what has happened in this country is that there have been constitutional attorneys who have bent that around and said, well, we're going to take the fire in the movie theater and we're going to twist it around and say, if you cause anyone through your free speech to be in fear of their life, then it's not free speech. It has to be regulated. And that's the problem we come into. That's where regulation filters over into constitutional law, because if you talk about regulating behavior, then you have a situation where you're placing limits on people's freedoms. And those are
like the social media ones you were mentioning before. So in the social media, we're seeing a lot of expansion upon that. It's misinformation, and then they kind of do like it's national defense or what is it, like NSA kind of thing. I'm trying to think of the right word there or phraseology, but
It's something that will dictate surveillance because
right,
of the behavior. And
right,
again, if you live in okay, so one of the things that I believe we've moved away from a polite society. In the beginning, we had people here that came here for religious freedom. People were still polite. Even when they were in war, they were still polite, because people did not realize at that point how far they could push human behavior to incite different responses and attitudes from other people. And so if we get back to a more polite society where people say, look, I respect your speech if you respect mine. Do unto
right.
others as we do unto you. So if we get back to something like that, the likelihood of having to regulate speech, I believe, will become far less than it is today.
Yeah, I mean,
People will not.
I've always said people, I remember years and years ago, I would say, when someone gets on the phone, they're 10 foot tall. And that's the exact same thing I notice on, social media. I mean, they'll rip me a new one and expect me just to take it, kind of thing. And
Yes. And it's like society today. For example, when I send business emails, I always use very polite titles. I've had some people say, "Oh, that surprises me." When I see them in person, I said, "Well, it shouldn't because that's the way I was raised." And so you look at the way people that are raised that way as compared to the people who are raised to just shout it out and throw it there. No greeting, no nothing. They just throw it out there, and it's for you to take or leave. And
right,
that's why I think if we move back to a more polite society, and again, polite society. See, I think one of the things that's important to realize here, moving into NESARA is just not about a handful of things. It's almost like a web. We are looking at a woven fabric here that involves a lot of different elements. And those elements include people having the opportunity to improve education, to improve language skills, to improve their knowledge about math and science, to improve their knowledge about interpersonal relations, the law, whatever, art, music, whatever it may be. And all those things make for a more rounded, more polite, better person in society. And
right.
if we start doing that, a lot of the other types of regulations that the deep state and the administrative state has wanted to throw on people, you're going to say, well, of course, there's no need for that because we don't have the administrative state anymore. But then people just see a natural involvement to being, again, I hate to use the term, a kinder, gentler people because they're approaching things in a more professional, family-oriented way,
Right.
and I say family-oriented because, parents teach their children what they would like them to be when they get older. And, children will spat back and forth with each other, but they still have strong feelings of love and admiration for each other as they go forward. And so what we want to try and do, I believe, is to get back to nurturing that kind of an environment.
Right.
You can have disagreements without being disagreeable.
That's great. That's great. Okay, well, let's jump into what Mathis asks here. So he was talking about fake profiles. Will they be prosecuted in the future? And by the way, there's just this massive number that are coming out against me and a bunch of other truthers. Or there's literally thousands of them everywhere, and they're saying things like, "Have you opened up your QFS account?" And they're using my picture, they're using my information. Sometimes they've actually typed exactly things that I've written to make themselves sound like me. And this is a big pervasive issue that I can't get anyone in those 3-letter agencies to even listen to me on that way. So how would that, how might you see that?
Well, I think one of the things so again, if we're responsible for our acts and actions, and we are responsible for the things that we put out there in public, the things that we do, the efforts that we undertake with someone else, okay, there's an ultimate degree of accountability. And what I really believe is that we as a society have been surveilled, if you will, for a long time, probably 60 years or more. And, by the time they ended up, having the internet put out there for people to use, regardless of who created it, we have a situation where.
Well, Al Gore did it. So.
Absolutely, yes.
Okay. Yeah, right.
And so if we look at this, there were still ways of surveilling people. I mean, for example, if you look at in the military, for example, they would watch the letters going back and forth with people. They would pay attention to who's getting what, how many times it's coming in.
Right.
Even like in some of the old movies on some of the prisoner of war, they would get letters that have all these words cut out of them. And they say, well, thanks a lot. I wanted to read that, but it doesn't make any sense because everything's been cut out. So the administrative state has been surveilling people for a long period of time. They've been watching them. They've been trailing them. They're aware of their behavior. So I believe that they have all this knowledge about what everybody is doing. The question I have and what I wonder about is, okay, so when do we flip the switch to start the process of taking what we know as a society or as the people that are in control and going after those who do it? And I'll kind of segue on this into the financial crimes enforcement network. If you look at the number of entities out there that are trying to defraud various people, a lot of times there may be LLCs set up, there may be umbrella LLCs set up, these sham corps that have people working for them doing all kinds of things. If they have to start registering and people have to identify who they are, there's going to be less of a likelihood that those people are going to want to do that. And so it's going to be easier, I believe, for law enforcement agencies to capture them and to hold them accountable. Right. The other part of it is, I think as we go forward, I've heard reference made to, for example, the QFS phone or some of these unique phones that we're going to be getting that will allow us the ability to keep track of our finances and things of that nature. Well, I also believe that phone is going to come with a stepped up security measure that's going to keep all of these people away from trying to get your information, trying to spam you, trying to do a variety of other things. So there's filters that they can put in place to stop this. But I just believe that the deep state is allowing that to go forward because, again, it's part of the money laundering process. It's part of gathering information on people and taking people's resources and using it for the deep state's benefit. And I believe once we move into NESARA, a lot of that stuff is going to go by the wayside.
Well, that's beautiful. I mean, because, the quantum financial system has one of the key elements of this kind of distributed blockchain ledger is, or distributed ledger blockchain, excuse me, is identify, it's Scott. I have to identify myself. So there has to be enough information that it is me. And to use a Elon term, we got a blue check mark, in essence, that's a certified person. So if I'm going to access, funds in that way or a voting issue, then, all I would do is show my QFS capability, in essence. And it's not trying to be like Mark of the Beast. That's not where we're going here because there's more to the Mark of the Beast. If to get deeper into that one, but it's just a way of doing that. Well, that shuts down a lot of the defrauding on a whole bunch of levels on voting and on financial issues too.
Yes, it does. And I think that we have some of that now, but the difficulty we have is that people need to be vigilant. And there's so many people that if they get a text message, they look at it and all of a sudden they hit it. And they fail to remember the fact that if they get a text message, they need to read first, think about it. And if they're uncertain, just delete and report as spam.
Right.
If it's somebody who's really trying to get in touch with you, there are other ways they can get in touch with you. But sure. So there's an easy way to deal with it. Same thing is true with emails. People are likely to click on something if they don't get a lot of them. For me, in my line of work, I will get sometimes 200 emails in a day. Mm-hmm. Now that the election's over with, I don't have to worry about that. But it takes a certain amount of vigilance and diligence to go through and look at what you get and what it means and how it's tracked to. Right. And that's going to help take care of some of this. The other part of it is there's just people out there that are up to no good and they're trying to trip people up as much as they can. But I believe there will come a point in time where all of that stuff falls by the wayside. Right. And as we see, with the Trump administration coming in and some of the different things that are taking place there, I believe we're going to start to get a visual picture of what these changes are going to look like.
Right. Okay. So, now we come into this season and we were going to talk, I think, before the election, if I remember right.
Yes.
We didn't, and my wife got really sick. I couldn't go to the Boise conference with that too. Weird circumstances with that, but most of us had thought, well, we're not going to hit an election because they haven't fixed all the points of an election. Scott was wrong. It's okay. Again, we were predicting in that way, but again, this is still in the middle of war. So we have this situation. We still have these potentials for an EBS because we talk about this EBS, which is emergency broadcast signal, started from JFK and it now is morphed into the EAS. That we would finally have disclosures about the reality of what's going on, so it could stop the silliness with that too. And so, you and I were talking about this, and I think you have a unique perspective upon this because now we're past it. Trump wins in that day, and yet there's still all kinds of people out there that we know, like the North Carolina governor, whoever that freak is, I can't remember his name. One, Carrie Lake's, competitor, who's actually claimed that he wants to kill her or something or other. He won, even though he got more more election amount than Kamala got in the state. So that doesn't make any sense either with that too. How would you kind of present that? You and I were talking about that.
Well, I think I was thinking about this since we talked, and I think I would put it this way. I live in an area where when we get storm warnings that come through, and I usually rely on several different weather channels and apps to find out what's taking place. The thing that always was a head scratcher for me is, why are you telling me heavy rain is predicted, or heavy rain is nearby when it's already passed?
Right.
Why would you tell me that there are severe weather warnings through when I've already lived through it?
Right.
I've had situations where the tornado's gone through, and then they tell me there's a tornado warning. So I start with that premise because from a logical perspective, I personally take a look at this and say, okay, so I hear everybody talking about, so when's the EBS coming? When's the EBA coming? When's the EAS coming? Right. Everybody's kind of wondering, we can't do this, we can't do that until it happens. And my perspective is, it already happened. It happened on January 6th, 2021, when President Trump came out there and talked to the people at the Capitol, and he said, be peaceful, go home. Spend time with your family. You don't need to be in here. You don't need to be doing this. Be peaceful, go home. He followed everything under the prescription of the Insurrection Act. That was the alert. And what happened when the alert came out? They took him off Twitter. And so it went down. So people didn't get a chance to hear it. They eventually put it back up. But again, that's like putting up the warning when the storm's gone through.
Right.
I can see the lightning and hear the thunder. And so that's the audio part that I'm hearing. The visual part is the lightning that takes place. And I can see heavy rain coming down. But then when it's over with, don't tell me I got a heavy storm coming, because it's already passed. And I think this is what happens with the alert system. Because again, when we get an alert in life and somebody says, this is going to happen, that's going to happen, we start paying attention. Our senses are peaked. We listen, we hear, we smell, we look at everything we have to do, and then our memory kicks in to compare it with something previously. And I believe President Trump, when he made his video on the lawn of the White House encouraging people to go home, which was after people were beginning to move up to Capitol Hill.
Sure.
That was the EBS or EAS or whatever terminology you want to put to it. That's when the process started. And so what happens after that is that we've now been put on alert that something is taking place. And so what do? We stop, look, and listen. We're observant of what's taking place. And what do we see? We saw what happened in the Senate. We saw what happened in the Congress. We saw what's going on in DC. We saw the videos of the people that were coming in. What are the important things that happened there? They grabbed Nancy Pelosi's laptop. It wasn't the fact that somebody was in the office. They grabbed the laptop. Why did they grab the laptop? Because she had all the evidence on it that was necessary to demonstrate that these people committed crimes against humanity. All the
By the
money
way,
laundering that took place. I mean, I can go on. I can keep going on with this. My
no,
point.
that's great, but I want to throw this out at you because the fascinating point. I didn't know until I interviewed Brandon Flowers, who was the guy that sit behind Fauci and was making faces
Yes.
at this. So I interviewed him, and you got this great point about Nancy Pelosi. They picked up her laptop. Brandon Flowers and several other people were sitting in her office. There's no one in there. They're sitting in her office. He said, all I did is plugged into the wall so I could charge my phone, and people were handing around a doobie, in the middle of that. And that's what I got arrested for, is sitting in her office. Well, it's so fascinating you just brought that up with
Yes.
this.
And see, again, I think from my perspective, I have not received, like other people out there, I don't have any inside connections where I'm getting inside information from anybody. I'm not close to people in the military currently,
Right.
or connected to some of the other things going on. I just believe that from the way I look at this, you have the alert, and then you start watching what happens after you have the alert. And you have all these other activities take place, and then you follow it forward. And I mean, I could go forward and identify all the different things that have taken place. I do believe that tracks with the Q boards. I do believe that there's a lot of information that we have seen that is supposed to come after the alert, and so this makes sense. And then I believe also that when we sit here and look at some of the court cases that have taken place, that the alert had to be in place, because I don't believe we would be seeing the things from the Supreme Court that we see now had there not been some trigger event where somebody turned on the light switch and said, we're going forward. Mm-hmm. And so I can lay all those types of things out. And when I look at even something like the Afghanistan withdrawal, right. There's things that tie back to this, which are basically going to be future proofs past. And we sit here and look at the trigger that's been set off. And so from my perspective, I think not only does that, give me comfort in knowing that we're moving through this process towards an end, but that everything that I would expect to see happen has been happening. And so, for example, with the election, I'll use that as an example. I thought there were several different ways the election could go. But again, if we look at the Bronson case, and if we look at the executive orders that are in play, okay, what people don't realize is that Donald Trump spent his first 4 years getting things prepared for the next 4. And even if I go back and look at something like the financial criminal enforcement network that's out there, that actually, there was a huge amount of discussion about that during Trump's administration. And people will say, well, he never signed it into law. No, there was a Defense Reauthorization Act that he vetoed. And he vetoed that because it did not provide increase in pay for the veterans. It did not provide increase in pay for the military workers. It placed a lot of the U.S. military in harm's way. That was the most important thing to him. But buried in that act was the CTA, which is the Corporate Transparency Act. And so what Congress did is they made that National Defense Reauthorization Act veto-proof and passed it. But if you look at what Steve Mnuchin did, Steve Mnuchin was one of the leaders pushing for this. If you look at the executive orders, even 13818 and 13848, you've got to have a mechanism in place to identify who the bona fide business people are that are legally engaged in conducting a business, as opposed to those who they have sham umbrella corporations, they're moving property around, they're laundering money. If you look even at the most recent case that took place there in Tennessee, where the sheriff's home was raided, where he spent all this time conducting an in-depth investigation as to the linkage between money laundering and BLM and Act Blue and the Democrats. They seized all the information. But what's important is that the information is already known by people.
Right.
And so we've got a couple of these things that are being done, that are being used by the good guys with the administrative state's help to be able to put the last few things in place so we can start the process of moving forward. I don't believe that NESARA kicks in until we make certain that no one's going to be harmed. None of the good people will be harmed. And what FinCEN does is it says, these are the people that are conducting legitimate business operations. All the rest of them,
Can I
Not so
pause
much.
you there because that's such a
Sure.
great, interesting point. I got all upset about FinCEN. You might have seen that, but I
Yes.
got all upset about FinCEN because it eliminates all of the idiots we know for a fact do the money laundering.
Yes.
But it only identifies small businesses. That's frankly only ones it actually puts out there, unless you're an accountant or
Well,
whatever.
well, actually, could I go back a little bit? Sorry for
Yeah.
interrupting here, but okay. So if we go back to the Patriot Act from 2001, and you read the history of that, okay, they have been working on building levels of government transparency and corporate transparency back to day one. And see, this is why I believe that even back to the Bush years, we had white hats working underway within government and outside to begin to build the layers of protection necessary to allow NESARA to come into play. People say you read the recent iteration of the Corporate Transparency Act, and you go through and you see all the exclusions there. But if you read deep into it, okay, so it says CPAs are not going to be covered. But do you realize that CPAs can go to jail if they don't encourage people to complete forms? Same is true with attorneys. And I've had experience talking to some attorneys and CPAs, and what do? They give me the paperwork. And I say, well, you actually should be doing this for a client. And they go, well, we got to be careful about that. And I said, well, if you read the act and you read the notice of rulemaking that went in play, you guys have a responsibility to at least tell anybody who asks that they need to register. Because if they say, well, I talked to so-and-so who's a CPA and they told me I didn't have to, well, guess what? That guy's now in trouble, or that woman's now in trouble, because they actually encouraged someone to not obey the law. So there's a lot of intricacies with this that I don't think people totally understand. When it first hits you, there they go asking for more information. I'm losing my privacy. I don't have any confidentiality anymore. But actually what it's doing is it is helping you be protected under NESARA, because when they swipe in with NESARA and they take away all the evil money, the last thing they want to do is take away the money from an innocent person.
I never thought of that. You just blew my mind. I changed a little bit of my viewpoint of that CTA, and I probably am wrong on that, but we'll see. I guess.
Well, and again, I go to the situation with property. Okay, so if I'm an LLC and I have real estate, okay, I want to protect my real estate. So if I have rental properties in the community, if I mean, just a small LLC that's a property manager, I want to be protected because I don't want somebody else I know who runs the same kind of LLC that's a money laundering operation,
right,
where they're playing around with mortgages and everything else. So for me, I see that as a benefit that protects what I have from the authorities coming in and taking it.
Yeah. I mean, I can see another way of that, but that neither here nor there. That was you blew my mind. So we'll have to talk about that later. But
absolutely,
let's bounce back into where you were going. You were talking about the election,
yes,
and then direction with that too. So Trump wins.
Yes. So okay. So in this situation, Trump wins, and you've got the words out there with Raskin talking about the 14th Amendment. And again, what Raskin doesn't understand, even if you were to implement the 14th Amendment, you've got the Brunson case over here that says, hey, wait a minute, guys, you never signed an oath of office. At one point, many, many years ago, I was a locally elected official. I could not take my seat with the body until I signed an oath of office, and I swore for the oath of office. And the point of it is that members of Congress, when they went through their swearing in and everything else, they never signed an oath. I don't think you can find one video out there where they signed an oath of office. And if you look for it, the oaths of office are not there. If you do a FOIA, they don't exist. So therefore, the people who are not legitimately holding down the office have no legal authority to pass law. They have no legal authority to spend money. They have no legal authority to do anything the Constitution permits them to do. And I believe that we had to get to 2024 because we had people who were elected in 2018. And again, here's something interesting. If you look at the executive orders, they became effective in September of 2018.
Right.
Well, what's interesting is that some places have primary elections earlier in the year. And the rule of law, the procedure for a primary election is if you run unopposed, The primary is your general.
Oh, right. Yes.
So therefore, in order to get the general election from 2018, 2020, 2022, 2024, you also have to allow time to get those local folks who got in there because they had no general election. They ran unopposed in the primary, and when they won their
Right.
primary, which was pre-September, they were automatically in office. So again, I think that's another consideration that people don't look at. And again, if we're trying to ferret out crime and things like that, I think that's an important consideration.
Wow. Okay. So, all right. So now Trump is Trump is president-elect. We have Jamie Raskin, spouting off that we're going to use the 14th Amendment under the third section because he's violated the oath of office and says that he can't, he can't serve as president. And they'll bring up all the other things because they'll say he led an insurrection, the January 4 years before with that too.
Yes.
And yet you said something even more fascinating about that in relation to inauguration points.
Yes. What's interesting is that if the president is duly elected and we go through the process and we have the electoral college, so
and they all admit that part. They're all right now. This is the cool part. They admitted that.
Yes. So you have the electoral college. Okay. So the difficulty you have is that so the new Congress that gets sworn in, and again, I will digress a bit here to the Senate. So we have a third of the Senate that's going to be sworn in. We have 2/3 that are currently in because every 2 years we elect a third of the Senate. So if we take a look at that, even with the 1/3 that's coming in and the Republicans have a majority, okay, the difficulty you have when you go through this process of certifying the electoral college votes, the people that are actually doing that are the ones that are going to be sworn in January.
Oh, okay, right.
And so if the people, so today, for example, if you look at the vote
when
count,
do they get sworn in? Isn't it like the 5th or is it?
I think it's January 2nd.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Okay.
So it's been a while since I've looked at that, but I got to
somewhere
go
in
back
that
and
range.
double
Though.
check.
It's before the 6th.
Yes.
I knew that, but I just didn't know.
Yes, so they have this formal process where they bring people in and they do the ceremonial swearing in and everything else. But the interesting thing is when you take a look at that, so if we have a Republican Congress, and I'm talking about the House of Representatives, right. Raskin has also said that they have been working with the rhinos in Congress to have the votes to thwart the Electoral College certifying the president. Now, what I think is interesting with that is that, again, because of our checks and balances, we have the activity going on in the House, we have the activity going on in the Senate, but then we have a president who received electoral and popular votes. Correct. So the difficulty that exists by these people that are threatening that is that, number one, if they don't have a valid oath of office on record, they can't vote. So, I mean, that goes away with that. So again, I tied this back in. When I talk about this being like a woven fabric, if you will, the Brunson case goes back to the oath of office. If you don't have a valid oath of office, you can't vote.
But it also, but Brunson case also says that on January 6, 2021, they didn't meet to discuss the validity of the Electoral College.
That is correct. And what that case does is so you hear Amana Savin talking about things like, we got to fix 2020. He's made that his focal point. And what the Brunson case does is it basically goes back to 2020 and say, look, you guys didn't have a valid oath of office. So therefore, what you did was not legal. That's issue number one. Issue number two, you have all the invalid ballots that were put in place. And they've got all the proof of the ballots of the manipulation of the
election.
Well, it's Mike Lindell. And if you listen to Jovan Pulitzer, he talks about the watermarks on the paper. And if you look at, if you go through and take a look at the ballots themselves, a lot of the ballots were bogus. We saw people delivering them in the middle of the night. We saw trucks moving back and forth. And they had the same type of thing take place this year. And that's why I believe this year was helpful for the public to see because that validated what many of them didn't see in 2020. So if we start pulling all these different things together, the one fail-safe that we have, is that if they step up and try and do something with President Trump being certified as the nominee, we have the military. The military can easily step in and say, okay, you guys are under arrest because of this, that, and the other. And that's why I think if you look at this as a whole, we are beginning to see the process move forward because we've already been told it's going to happen. January 6th, we were put on alert. And if we go back and look at how all this comes into play, we're just seeing some of the last few pieces fall into place.
I mean, that's so amazing. And again, guys, I want you all to listen. I'm telling you, you probably need to back up and listen to this one or two times because Roger's not saying, and Scott's not saying that it's January 6th, 2025, that it can't happen, today, that it, can happen by the 20th, but somewhere in that range of time. And actually Trump has indicated he's worried about this time frame. Well, he's not worried, he knows, but he's intimating there's going to be something that happens. And Raskin says it. And if they tried on January 6th to decertify Trump, in essence, well, then that brings forward a military response. Or if Trump, swears an oath into office on the 20th, and all the rest of the people haven't, done their swearing or their oath taking, that also brings in another level of that too.
Yes, and what I'm saying, Scott, with my approach to this is that there are, it's sort of like looking at a calliope, if you will. The pipes where the sounds come out of it. You see different pipes moving up and down to generate the sound. That's actually what I believe is going on here. We have different silos, if you will, or different types of things that are occurring, and we need to get to the point of where they start to move with the right degree of commonality.
Right.
And we see these things come together. And I'm not saying that what Raskin said is going to come true. I'm not saying he's not going to try and do it. It's just like with the news media. The news media is out there doing their part because they have a role to play in this process. And do I believe that the news media is a captured operation? I do. And that I believe people are engaged and performing in a certain way because that's what they've been told they have to do. On the other hand, as more of this comes out, I mean, even the most recent stories of where Harris paid all these celebrities to appear at campaign events.
Right.
I mean, to me, you don't do that because by you doing that, you're saying that they have a valid purpose for the campaign and you're paying them. They always volunteer their time. And so even from something like the Federal Elections Commission, you're getting into trouble by spending unauthorized funds on something not related to a campaign. That's no different than paying a family member because they talk to you at night before you go to bed and you're running for office. You can't do that. So
but you can't do that. But you can't do that. Like even as an ad, one of the horrible things is ads on TV for some idiot drug, and they have to stipulate that's a paid actor instead of the person who, has the ailment and takes the drug. So in essence, we're talking about there's no transparency in that as well. And that is, she's violating campaign law. I mean, election integrity over and over again.
Yes. And so, for example, if we look at this, so this law that we talked about earlier, the FinCEN, it's the Corporate Transparency Act. Campaigns have talked about being transparent. The Federal Elections Commission requires transparency. The FDA requires transparency. Everybody wants transparency, but a lot of people go to cover it up because they don't want the public to see what's going on. And I believe this process is about exposing people and exposing what's going on. I've looked at some of the state campaign contributions around the time that the sheriff was arrested in Tennessee with all of his findings. And I mean, state house races, these people were getting $400,000 from Act Blue. Right. So if it's a lowly state house race in the swing states, and they're getting $400,000 in October from Act Blue, that's money laundered, and that it's corrupt. And yet some of the people who got it won. But that means they accepted money, and under the executive orders that had been put in place, and I would say it's more than 13818 and 13848. There's a lot of them in there that come into play. If you go through and read all of Trump's executive orders, they are building blocks for what's going to happen.
Yep.
And if you take a look at this, you're going to see a number of these people, by accepting that money, get arrested and lose everything they have. You're going to see people who went out and tried to defend what they are doing be arrested because they're engaging in treasonous activity. You're going to see a lot of different things take place because people were not aware of what they were doing, or they were aware and they did it anyway.
Well, Dave with News Treason, just this morning I was having a conversation, and in Oklahoma there's the state senators, and the two of the guys stopped by the house, right? And I was talking to them, and they were saying that they were awakened or whatever it is, and yet when I look at it, listen, I've done marketing more times than I can count, right? A direct mail piece, they're probably dropping $5,000 direct mail pieces, which cost on average at best, and these are full color suckers that cost you maybe at best 68 cents per. And you're talking about they've done multiples of that. Everyone has all gotten many multiples of campaign issues, mostly in those primary races, but you also see them in the general election. And so you look at this and you're going, some of these people have spent 40, 50, 100, $150,000 for a job that you only make in Oklahoma. It's $45,000 a year. You're like, how can you do that? And the answer is they're getting money from someone else to be in the race, and then they're culpable at that moment.
Yes, that's correct. I mean, it's in the past. I've watched this industry very closely. I am familiar with it for a long period of time. It used to be, if you go back in time, it didn't cost that much to run for an elected office. Then all of a sudden you got money involved in it. And if you go back to even the 1980s, when everybody was reeling from Watergate, so they were going to set up political action committees as a means of corporations being able to compete favorably with the unions. And the unions set up their own. And then you carry that forward to Citizens United and all the money that comes into the political action committees, the ballots committees, all these different nonprofit organizations. The corruption that exists with money is unreal. And that's where the money laundering is taking place. Right. And the recipients of that money are taking it, and they have no idea where it came from. And if it's connected to illicit activity by them being recipients of the money, they're responsible. They lose everything they have, and they lose their position, and they may even go to jail. And that's why I wonder sometimes these people that say, well, I'm awakened, but if you look at their campaign reports, look at who they got money from. They're really not that awakened, because they still have the urge to take the money and to be elected.
Right.
And for most people, if they look at how NESARA is going to come in and take care of this, it changes everything. And that's why the term limits are a good thing. Rotating people in and out of the elected office for all levels of government are a good thing. Giving people a chance to take a brief delay in their work and go be an elected official someplace for a couple of years and then go back. We all benefit from that because we don't have the control that all the money is generating.
Right.
And I think that's where we're missing the boat. So as I was talking earlier about how I think this is proceeding forward with the president, it's a matter of identifying some of these lower ballot people here and some of the other folks that are continuing to participate in what I would refer to as proceeds from illicit activity. They have to be identified in order to protect the innocent people.
Oh, wow. Okay, I'm blown. And so guys, I'm gonna have to really reevaluate my fence and the CTA thing conversation on that, because it might be something really interesting the White Hats are doing. I mean, again, we don't know 100% on that particular thing, but it might be something that might be better than we think, but neither here nor there. The interesting part you brought up is the EBS might have been activated, and then we'll have a termination. Guys, understand there is a termination point. some point or another, the military has to step in, and we might be sitting on a very short fuse date, whether it's the 6th or the 20th or sometime before that. So,
Well, and I think one of the other parts to that too, it's kind of like a storm warning. They always give you the all clear. They always tell you that it's over with. You don't need to be concerned about what's going to take place. And so I think there will be one of those situations that occurs. And I think people will begin to see that, yes, it's getting lighter out. The severe threat is over with. We're going to start to see some things take place. But I think what has to happen is that we have to go through this process to wake up the people who are not awake. And that's where we get the near-death experience. People are going to have to feel that their continued support of the deep state, of the illicit activities and so forth, is going to cost them their lives, or at least feel that that's what the threat is, because that threat has to occur. And so I believe that over the course of the next, say, 3 to 6 months, we're going to start to see that, whether it's protests in the street that lead to some kind of bad behavior, whether it's a misfire of a nuclear weapon, whether it's, whatever it may be, another assassination attempt, whether it's, earthquakes, whatever the deep state has that they can foist upon our country to wake the last of the people awake that need to be awakened. Now, granted, there may be a small number of people that you're never going to awaken, but then those will probably leave the country. But the rest of the folks have to have an opportunity. They got to be given one more chance. It's like, I'm a Christian. I believe that, God taps you on your shoulder all the time and says, you better not do that. You got to wake up. You got to change. And we are given all the time opportunities to reverse course,
right,
and do things that improve the lives of others, improve our own lives. And sometimes for some people, it takes a long time before they really understand that means them.
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of where we're at right now with some of these things taking place. The markets, maybe for people, if there's an adjustment in the markets, they're going to feel like I've lost everything I had. Can they go on after that? They may not be able to. Hopefully they will be able to, when they come to the realization that, it's money, and money is a tangible asset that can easily be replaced at some point in time. Your life's the most important. Maybe it's loss of a job. Maybe it's, bad weather that creates a problem, but the human spirit, I believe, is going to be given a chance to recover from these events and walk into that better life that everybody has wanted for a long period of time, but they've never had the opportunity to realize that means them. They can't do it. And that's why I think we're going through this process now, and we have to be aware of what the challenges are that we face, because they may not be as bad as they seem, but for some people, they're going to be the end of the world. And we have to be there for them and help them through the process and get them to understand that, no, we are going to be moving into a better place. It's just that we got to go through this process to get there.
Right. Well, another thing you blew my mind with that too. It's a very good point. When the storm comes on 9:30 in the morning, let's say, or whatever, time frame that is, there is an all clear, like at 11 o'clock, the storm went through, and so those are the two warning points, that, the beginning and the end. And we might be coming to the end warning point, which is what we always thought was the first one, but there has to be two of them.
Yes.
It even happens, and that is very consistent with what Kennedy created for the EBS. You still have to say, okay, we're in a warning period of time, but then the warning is over, and go back to your original programming, whatever that might be, in essence, with that too.
So we now return you to the regular scheduled programming, so that we all expect to see. So, and again, I think at that point, when we get to that point, I think that's when we see the flip take place. And to me, that just makes sense, because at that point in time, they will have identified all the illicit money that's out there, all the illicit activity. They'll identify who the actors are. They'll start rounding people up, and we'll begin to see that, it's a little bit lighter on the horizon. We're getting close to that period, and then they'll come out with the all clear, and people will come out and look around and, see what's going on, and they'll realize that they made it through the storm. So I don't mean to be simplistic, but
no, I think that's
kind of the way I look at it. So
I think it's wonderful. And again, guys, we can all have perspectives on this kind of thing. This is just giving you a unique thing that's blowing my mind. That's why I love Roger. He's such a wonderful guy. And I promise you guys, I want you just to have hope and encouragement of this, okay? And just have a new insight. And that's why what Roger helps with that. And that's what I'm trying to give you with that too. So thank you so much for listening. If you like what we did, leave comments. I promise you, if you more comments you leave, that we can, answer questions. Happy to have Roger back on with that too.
I'd be happy to do that too.
All right.